Someone else moved in from far.
He didn't look like himself that night, not because of the suit or the haircut, or the way his shoulders sat slightly higher, as if he was trying to remember how someone else carried their life. It was the eyes. The eyes were the only thing he couldn't change. And for a few minutes, just a few, he stood outside a black cab in London, watching the door close on the man who was supposed to be him. The driver didn't even hesitate. No double take, no question, just a nod, and the quiet click of a door shutting on a life that didn't belong to him. And then the cab rolled away, leaving Maurice Gibb on the pavement, alone, with a name he wasn't meant to use, and a night he wasn't meant to survive. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves, because what happened next wasn't the kind of story people told loudly. It was the kind of story that only ever appeared in whispers, and only years later when the damage was already done. Maurice Gibb had spent his whole life surrounded by noise, the kind of noise that follows you even when the room goes silent. Applause, cameras, flashbulbs, laughter that felt too loud to be real, and the constant, restless feeling that everyone wanted something from you, even when they claimed they didn't. But there was another kind of silence Maurice learned to recognize, a silence that didn't feel peaceful, a silence that felt like something being held back. And if you listen closely to the way people spoke about him, especially the people who knew him before the world did, you start to notice something strange. They often described him as the funny one, the playful one, the one who could break a room open with a grin and a perfectly timed line. But almost nobody described what happened after the laughter ended. Almost nobody described what he was like when the room emptied, or what he did when the lights went out. And that's where the story begins. Not with fame, not with disco, not with the Bee Gees at their peak, but with the quiet problem Maurice carried for years. A craving that didn't make sense. A hunger for something ordinary, not privacy, not comfort, not rest. Something harder than all of that, normal. Just one night where nobody wanted anything. One night where he could walk into a room and not be recognized as a voice, a hairstyle, a memory on the radio. One night where he could exist as a stranger. That desire, quiet, persistent, followed him through the most glittering years of his life. And in London, where the nights were long and the city didn't ask questions, Maurice learned something early. There were places you could go where even fame had rules, private clubs with velvet ropes, basement lounges where the walls absorbed secrets, tables where people didn't introduce themselves by name, but by what they could offer. And somewhere in that world, somewhere between celebrity and high society, Maurice is said to have met someone who understood him in a way almost nobody else could. Not another musician, not another actor, not even another star, a royal, or at least someone royal enough that people spoke about him carefully. The details have never been confirmed in any official way. No biography prints the name cleanly. No interview gives you the moment on tape. It exists the way certain stories do, passed between people who were there or people who knew someone who was. A whispered London legend, a rumor that never fully dies because it feels almost too perfect, almost too symbolic. The story goes like this. Maurice met a young European royal, one with enough privilege to vanish for a night and enough loneliness to want to. They were introduced in a place where titles didn't matter. at least not on the surface. A private room, a quiet gathering, a table with too many glasses and too much unspoken tension. And at some point, someone made a joke about how Maurice could pass as almost anyone with the right clothes, about how, if he wanted to disappear, he could. And the royal, tired of being watched, tired of being guarded, tired of being someone, leaned into it, because what Maurice wanted was the very thing the royal had never had: to be ordinary, to be unseen, to be left alone. And what the royal wanted was exactly what Maurice couldn't escape: to be treated like he mattered, to walk into a room and have doors open, to have people smile even when they didn't mean it, to have the world bend around him without him asking. Two men from opposite ends of the world, both trapped, both smiling as if they weren't. And that's where the dangerous idea was born, not in a plan, not in a schedule, in a moment of reckless curiosity. A night where they would trade lives, not forever, not even for long, just long enough to feel something different, to taste a life they couldn't reach any other way, to see what it felt like. The rumor says they arranged it quietly. No big entourage, no public spectacle, just a small circle. One trusted driver, one quiet fixer, clothes chosen carefully, a hairstyle adjusted, a ring removed, a watch replaced. Maurice dressed like the royal dressed like Maurice, and then they stepped out into London like two men wearing each other's skin. And for a little while, it worked. Maurice walked into a place he should never have been able to enter, not because he wasn't famous, but because fame isn't the same as power. Power is quieter. Power doesn't need applause. Power just moves. And the doors opened for him in a way he wasn't used to. People didn't just recognize him, they deferred to him. They softened their voices, they shifted their posture. They acted like he could change their lives with a sentence. And Maurice, who had been adored, yes, but also used, felt something he never expected to feel. Not joy, not excitement, something colder, something almost empty. Because in that moment, he realized something. Being treated like royalty didn't make you feel more human. It made you feel less, like you were no longer a person, just a symbol. And somewhere else in the city, the royal was living Maurice's life. A cab ride through London with no guards, a drink in a crowded place where nobody bowed, a laugh that wasn't careful, a conversation that didn't feel rehearsed. For the first time, the royal could be loud, could be ordinary, could be imperfect, could be free. And here's the part that always made people lower their voices when they told it. It wasn't the swap itself. It wasn't the thrill. It wasn't even the danger. It was what happened in the middle of it, the moment the fantasy cracked. Because, according to the rumor, there came a point when Maurice realized he couldn't keep playing the role, not because he was afraid, but because he started to feel something he hadn't expected, a kind of grief, like he was borrowing a life that didn't belong to him, while his own life, his real life, kept drifting further away. And at some point, outside a building lit like a dream, Maurice stepped out into the cold air. He stood on the pavement, and for a moment he didn't move, as if he was waiting for something, or listening for something, and then he saw it, a black cab pulling up, a man stepping inside, a man wearing Maurice's face. Maurice watched the door close, and the cab rolled away. And what followed was never explained publicly, because that's when the night turned. That's when the city stopped feeling like a playground and started feeling like a trap. And Maurice, standing there with a borrowed name, borrowed power, borrowed clothes, felt a strange fear settle into his chest. Not the fear of being caught, not the fear of scandal, but the fear of something deeper, the fear that he might not know how to return to himself. Because when you live too long as what the world wants, even one night of pretending can expose what you've been hiding. And Maurice had been hiding something for years, something even his closest circle didn't fully understand. And in London, on that night, it started to show. But not in the way anyone would expect, not with an outburst, not with a headline, with silence. A silence that followed him back into his life and stayed there. And the strangest part is, if this story was just a rumor, why did people who knew Maurice speak about London like it held a ghost? Why did the laughter in later years feel slightly forced whenever those nights were mentioned? Why did he always seem to look away when certain names came up? And why, years later, did someone close to him say there were nights Maurice came home and wouldn't explain where he'd been? Only that he didn't feel real anymore? Because whatever happened during that royal escape, it didn't stay in London. It followed him, quietly, patiently, like a shadow that never asked permission, and Maurice, who could make the world laugh, began carrying something he never named, something that didn't sound like a scandal, something that sounded like loss. Maurice didn't talk about that night the way people expect legends to talk about wild stories. If it happened, he didn't frame it as a triumph. He didn't tell it like a punchline. And that alone made it feel different from the usual celebrity mythology. Because Maurice could tell stories, he was brilliant at it. He could take an ordinary moment and make it sparkle. But this one stayed dim, almost sealed, and the people around him learned quickly not to push. Because whenever London came up, whenever that particular stretch of his life was mentioned, there was a small shift in him, not dramatic, not obvious, just a slight closing of the face, a pause before the smile. Like his mind had walked into a room it didn't want to enter. And over time, the rumor about the royal didn't spread because Maurice bragged about it. It spread because people noticed something else. They noticed what changed after. Because for a while Maurice seemed unsettled, not in a chaotic way, in a quiet way, as if he'd looked directly at something in himself and couldn't unsee it. It showed up in little moments, a sudden impatience with crowds, a strange discomfort when strangers called his name too loudly, a habit of leaving early, slipping away before the night peaked, not because he was angry, because he seemed tired of being seen. And that's where the story turns into something harder to describe. Because the truth is, Maurice had always played roles, not fake ones, survival ones, the funny one, the easy one, the one who made the room lighter when the room got heavy. But after London, people who loved him started to sense that the role was starting to cost him more than it used to. There were nights he would come back from, parties, and not say much at all, just sit, just stare, as if he was trying to remember where he left part of himself, and then, almost like a reflex, he'd turn the charm back on the next day, like nothing happened, like nothing was wrong. But the silence was still there underneath, and what followed was never explained publicly, because no one could point to one big event. There wasn't a single headline. There wasn't a public collapse. There was just a slow, strange drift. A man who had everything, beginning to behave like someone who didn't know what to do with it. And the rumor about the royal, about the identity swap started to feel less like a wild story and more like a symbol. Because the deeper you look at Maurice's life, the more you see that he wasn't chasing excitement. He was chasing disappearance. Even in rooms full of people, he seemed to be searching for the one corner where nobody would demand anything from him. And London, whether the royal story is fully true or not, represented the most dangerous version of that craving. To step out of his life, to become someone else, just for a night. And once you do that, once you taste what it feels like to not be Maurice Gibb, it becomes harder to return. Not because you hate your life, but because you realize how heavy it is. And the strangest part is, the rumor says the royal loved it, that the royal laughed more that night than he had in years, that he blended into the crowd like a normal young man, that he tasted freedom. But Maurice was the one who carried the aftermath, as if he'd discovered something painful, as if the night didn't give him escape. It gave him clarity, and clarity can be cruel, because it doesn't just show you what you want, it shows you what you've been missing. And Maurice had been missing something for a long time. Not fame, not money, not attention. Something smaller, something ordinary. Something like being able to walk down a street without feeling watched. Something like being loved without being consumed. Something like knowing who you are when nobody is clapping. And by the time the story reached the people who weren't there, it had already become a whisper, a strange little myth, a prince and a superstar trading skins for a night. But the people closest to Maurice didn't remember it like a myth. They remembered it like a doorway, like the moment he stepped too close to the edge of himself and never fully stepped back. There's a reason the story never settled into a clean ending, because if the royal escape was only about glamour, only about risk, only about a night of secret thrills, Maurice would have eventually laughed about it. He would have turned it into a tale he could control, a mischievous chapter, a clever trick, a famous man outsmarting the world for a few hours. But that wasn't the part that stayed with him. What stayed with him was something smaller, something almost invisible. And it was the kind of thing you only notice when you've lived too long inside a role. The rumor says that later, much later, Maurice admitted something in private, not as a confession, not as a dramatic revelation, just as a quiet sentence, spoken the way people speak when they're finally too tired to pretend. That when he put on the royal's clothes, when he walked into rooms where nobody expected him to be human, he didn't feel powerful, he felt erased. And when he saw the royal leave in that cab, wearing Maurice's face, Maurice didn't feel clever, he felt replaceable. That was the emotional truth hiding inside the myth. Not scandal, not danger, not a prince, but the sudden realization that the world didn't love Maurice Gibb. The world loved the idea of him, the performance, the charm, the sound of his name on a poster. And in London, for one strange night, Maurice saw how easily those things could be traded, how quickly identity could become costume, how quickly a man could be reduced to what he represented. And once he felt that, he couldn't fully unfeel it, because the swap didn't just let him escape his life. It showed him what his life looked like from the outside. It showed him how thin the line was between being adored and being used. And it explained something that people around him had always struggled to put into words. Maurice could be surrounded by love and still feel alone. He could be in a room full of friends and still feel like he had to perform to earn his place there. And maybe that's why that night haunted him. Because the royal for a few hours got to be ordinary, but Maurice for a few hours got to experience what it felt like to be untouchable. Not in a glamorous way, in a lonely way, like nobody was allowed to reach him, like nobody even wanted to. They only wanted what he could provide, and after that, he started holding parts of himself back, not because he stopped caring, but because he started protecting something, a small, fragile sense of self that he realized could be swapped away too easily. If the story is true, it also explains why Maurice didn't chase the myth again, why it didn't become a habit, why there weren't more nights like it, because the night didn't give him freedom. It gave him grief, and grief has a way of rearranging a person. Years later, people would remember Maurice as warm, funny, brilliant, a man who could fill a room. But there was always that quiet undertone in the way those closest to him spoke, as if they knew there was a part of him that stayed slightly out of reach, a part of him that had learned, maybe in London, maybe long before, that being loved by the world didn't guarantee being known. And that's why the royal escape story matters, not because it's glamorous, not because it's scandalous, but because it captures a truth that fame rarely admits, that sometimes the thing you think you want most is the thing that makes you feel least real. And Maurice, who spent his life giving people music that made them feel understood, sometimes struggled to feel understood himself. In the end, the story isn't really about a prince. It's about a man who wanted one night without expectations, and accidentally discovered that expectations were the only thing holding his identity together. So maybe the saddest part isn't what happened during that night. Maybe it's what happened after, the way he carried it quietly, the way he never fully explained it, the way it became one more thing he smiled through. And when people tell the story now, when it reappears as a rumor, a whisper, a legend, it's easy to focus on the swap, the mystery, the secret. But the real story is simpler. A man stood on a London street, watching someone else drive away with his face, and realized how easily the world could move on without him. And for the rest of his life, he never completely forgot that feeling, not in a bitter way, in a human way, a quiet understanding that being seen isn't the same as being held, and that sometimes the most dangerous escape is the one that shows you the truth, because once you see it, you can't go back to believing the illusion. And Maurice didn't. He just learned how to live with it.